What does it mean for history to forget? Not just to lose a date or misplace a name, but to erase entire worlds. Sometimes when we imagine the past, we picture it as a straight road, one civilization building neatly on the last. Stone becomes bronze, bronze becomes iron, myth becomes science, darkness becomes light. But the real story of humanity is not a straight road. It is a coastline, jagged, broken, washed over again and again by time. And along that coastline, there are places where the record simply disappears. Cities that once held tens of thousands fall silent in a generation. Languages vanish. Technologies die with their makers. Knowledge burns, sinks, or is buried beneath centuries of dust. We call these moments mysteries, but they are more than that. They are gaps in human memory, and when you stare into them long enough, you begin to realize something unsettling. Civilization is not permanent. It is fragile, like a flame carried through wind. Tonight, we begin a journey through 10 of these missing spaces in the human story. Places where the past feels less like a completed book and more like a torn manuscript. Our first stop is the ancient Mediterranean, around the year 1177 BCE. At that moment, the world was thriving. Great kingdoms traded across seas. Messengers traveled between palaces. Bronze weapons gleamed under sunlit walls. Writing systems recorded taxes, treaties, poems, prayers. The cities were alive with complexity. And then, within the span of a single lifetime, it ended. Not slowly, not peacefully, but catastrophically. The Hittite Empire, 5 centuries of power, vanished so completely that modern historians didn't even know it had existed until ruins emerged from the earth thousands of years later. Mycenaean Greece, the world of Agamemnon and Troy, collapsed into a dark age so deep that writing itself disappeared for 400 years. Trade routes snapped like thread. Libraries went quiet. Palaces burned. Across the Mediterranean, archaeologists find the same haunting signature: ash, charcoal, abandoned stone, a civilization-wide silence. And what makes this collapse so disturbing is not only the destruction, it's what followed. A loss of knowledge so complete that entire societies seem to fall backward into prehistory. Imagine living in a world with plumbing, paved roads, complex bureaucracy, and then watching it all dissolve. Not replaced, just gone. In one palace in Greece, at Pylos, clay tablets were found still drying when the fire came. They record ordinary things: grain, livestock, preparations. No panic, no prophecy. Just the everyday paperwork of a civilization that didn't realize it was writing its final sentences. And that is the first lesson of the gaps. The end rarely announces itself. The scribes did not know they were the last scribes. The builders did not know their hands would be the final hands. History often collapses quietly, while people are still planning for tomorrow. So what caused it? Raiders from the sea, the Egyptians said. Mysterious sea peoples, arriving like a storm. But how could raiders erase multiple empires at once? Others point to drought, to famine, to the breakdown of trade networks that supplied tin for bronze. A systems failure, like a web snapping. And yet, even that feels incomplete. Because humanity has survived droughts before. We have survived wars. So why did knowledge itself vanish? Why did writing disappear? Why did the world forget how to be the world it had been? Perhaps the most unsettling truth is this. We like to believe progress is inevitable, but the Bronze Age collapse whispers another possibility. that civilization is not a ladder. It is a balancing act, and sometimes the balance breaks. As we step forward into these lost centuries, burned libraries, silent cities, and vanished peoples, one question will follow us like an echo. How much of what we call human advancement is only temporary? And if it happened once, could it happen again? In the next chapter, we move from collapsed empires to something even stranger, a stretch of time that some believe may not have existed at all, a missing span of centuries where history itself might have been rewritten or imagined, or inserted like a phantom page into the book of the world. What if 3 centuries of history never happened? The idea sounds absurd, like the plot of a science fiction novel. But it's a theory that has haunted historians and chronologists for decades. A growing number of researchers argue that somewhere between 614 and 911 CE, the world's timeline doesn't add up. They call it the phantom time hypothesis. According to this theory, nearly 300 years were quietly inserted into our calendar during the early Middle Ages. Entire reigns, battles, and inventions may have been fabricated or misplaced. If it's true, we are not living in the 21st century, but the 18th. And the reasons given are chilling, not because they point to malice, but to ambition. Imagine a ruler, perhaps Otto III, desiring to reign in the symbolic year 1000, not the mundane 700s. Imagine church leaders eager to align their authority with prophetic timelines. In a time when most of the population could not read, when records were scarce and centralized, rewriting history was less a crime and more an opportunity. But what makes this theory compelling isn't just speculation, it's the silence in the ground. Archaeologically, there's a troubling absence across Europe between the 7th and 10th centuries. Building styles show abrupt leaps instead of gradual evolution. Pottery, coins, tools, things that should reveal the fingerprints of time simply don't appear in the quantities we expect. Carbon dating of artifacts from this period often places them either before or after the supposed missing centuries, rarely within them. Even the sky refuses to cooperate. Medieval chronicles describe eclipses and planetary events, but modern astronomy, when tracing those events backward, finds they don't match. The heavens record their own version of time, and in this case, it doesn't agree with the books. And then there's Charlemagne, the emperor who unified Europe, birthed a renaissance, and anchored a millennium of law. But his life, when examined closely, seems like a mosaic of inconsistencies. His chapel in Aachen reflects architectural methods not seen until centuries later. The biographies that describe him were written long after his death. No contemporary portrait exists. Even the coins bearing his name raise doubts. Is it possible that the man we know as Charlemagne was less a person and more a patchwork? Skeptics of the theory point to records outside Europe, Chinese dynasties, Islamic scholars. Surely, if 3 centuries were missing, someone, somewhere, would have noticed. But even these records, when examined closely, show gaps, later compilations, discrepancies. Could the silence be more widespread than we imagined? Or is the simpler answer that time itself is more flexible than we believe? Not because reality changed, but because memory did. The phantom time hypothesis might not be entirely true, but it reveals something important, that history is not just what happened, it's what we agree happened. And sometimes that agreement is more fragile than the facts. A missing century, whether invented or misrecorded, reminds us that the timeline we trust, the centuries and dates we hold sacred, are not carved in stone. They are constructed, layered atop older versions, shaped by politics, pride, and human error. In the end, the real question may not be whether those years existed, but how many other gaps remain hidden in the folds of time. How many ages passed in shadow, never written down. In our next chapter, we leave forged years behind and enter the flames of memory itself, to a place where knowledge was collected, preserved, and then lost in smoke. The Library of Alexandria. It began with a harbor. Every ship entering Alexandria was ordered to surrender its scrolls, not for confiscation, at least not officially, but for copying. The originals were often kept, the copies returned. In this way, the ancient city built something the world had never seen before, a memory made of papyrus. The Library of Alexandria. At its height, it may have held nearly 1,000,000 scrolls, treatises, maps, astronomical charts, plays, histories, formulas, blueprints, and dreams. It wasn't just a library. It was humanity's first attempt at collective memory, an archive of everything we knew. And then it vanished. Not in a single fire, as legend often claims, but in a series of losses, each more devastating than the last. Julius Caesar's siege in 48 BCE set part of the collection alight. Later, Christian zealots viewed pagan knowledge as dangerous and attacked the library's remaining texts. When Arab forces conquered Alexandria in 642 CE, legend says they burned what was left. But the cause matters less than the consequence, because when the scrolls turned to ash, so did centuries of accumulated wisdom. The Earth's circumference? Eratosthenes had calculated it with surprising accuracy. The heliocentric model? Aristarchus proposed it 1,800 years before Copernicus. Steam-powered machines. Hero of Alexandria built them, including a primitive programmable device. Medicine, engineering, astronomy, physics, literature, entire disciplines went dark. What we call the Renaissance was in many ways not a rebirth. It was a recovery. Europe, centuries later, was not discovering the world anew. It was rediscovering what Alexandria had once known. We glimpse the extent of the loss through shadows, mentions in later works of texts we can no longer read. Archimedes wrote treatises that are gone, their ideas surviving only as citations. Ptolemy's geography mapped the world with coordinates, but the maps themselves are missing. Sophocles wrote over 100 plays. We have 7. The burning of the library was not just a historical tragedy, it was a civilizational amnesia. Imagine if today, in a single night, every scientific database, every archive, every library were erased. That is what Alexandria was, and we still feel its absence because we keep stumbling across traces of that lost knowledge. In 2005, modern imaging revealed that a medieval prayer book contained a hidden manuscript beneath the ink, an overwritten work by Archimedes. In it, he outlined principles of integral calculus, 2,000 years ahead of his time. What else lies hidden? What ancient knowledge waits, buried in palimpsests, stored in forgotten languages, misfiled as myth? Perhaps Alexandria's greatest tragedy is not just what burned, but what it represented. The belief that knowledge was worth preserving, that ideas could be inherited, that humanity could pass the torch. We lost not just scrolls, we lost confidence in that dream. The library reminds us that knowledge is not permanent, that progress is not linear, and that forgetting can happen faster than remembering. In the next chapter, we go back further, before books, before writing, to a time when something stirred at the edge of civilization. and then was drowned in ice and fire. A reset, a silence that lasted 1,200 years, the Younger Dryas. It began with warmth. Around 10 to 800 BCE, Earth was healing. The last ice age was retreating. Forests returned, rivers swelled. Human beings, scattered in tribes, began to build, not just shelters, but something more enduring. Evidence from across the globe suggests that agriculture, symbolic art, and monumental architecture were beginning to emerge. The seeds of civilization had been planted. And then the sky changed. Within a decade, perhaps even within a year, global temperatures plunged. Ice sheets reversed course, surging southward. Wildfires swept continents. Sea levels rose over 300 feet, drowning coastlines. The Earth entered a sudden, violent freeze. We call it the Younger Dryas. To climatologists, it's a documented event, a dramatic climate reversal that lasted about 1,200 years. But to archaeologists, and to anyone who studies the fragility of progress, it is something else. A reset. Whatever path humanity was beginning to walk, it was cut off. The geological record tells the story in blackened layers: soot, platinum, high-temperature carbon. All signs point to a cataclysm. Perhaps a comet, exploding in the atmosphere, or multiple impacts that ignited entire landscapes. The Clovis people of North America vanish in the archaeological record at this moment. And then, for more than a millennium, the world went quiet. Civilization stopped before it started. But when it returned, around 9,600 BCE, it came back differently, faster, more sophisticated, too sophisticated. At Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, archaeologists unearthed megalithic stone circles more than 11,000 years old. Carved with animals, symbols, and geometric precision, the site appears to be a temple, built before agriculture, before cities, before writing. Its builders were supposed to be hunter-gatherers, yet the stones weigh up to 20 tons. The layout suggests architectural planning. The artwork reveals symbolic culture. And then the site was deliberately buried, backfilled with thousands of tons of soil as if to protect it. Who were these people, and why would they entomb their greatest creation? Some see Göbekli Tepe as a time capsule, a message from a forgotten world, a civilization trying to preserve memory through disaster. Elsewhere, the signs align. Plato's story of Atlantis, supposedly destroyed 11,600 years ago, matches the timeline of the Younger Dryas precisely. The Great Sphinx in Egypt, worn by water erosion in a region that hasn't seen heavy rainfall in 8,000 years, may predate the known Egyptian civilization by millennia. Ancient maps, like the Piri Reis map, show Antarctica's coastline, without ice, a view that hasn't existed for thousands of years. Who mapped it? Where did they go? And why did everything they built disappear? The Younger Dryas may have erased an earlier chapter of human history, one that we only glimpse through myths, anomalies, and ruins. Genetic studies suggest a population bottleneck around this time, a drastic reduction in diversity. Humanity nearly didn't make it, yet somehow memory did, or at least echoes of it. Across cultures, legends speak of floods, fire, sky serpents, and survivors carrying knowledge. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the story of Noah, the Vedic tales of cosmic weapons. Are these metaphors, or fading memories of a world lost? What did we build before the sky fell? And what fragments of that lost world still live in the foundations of ours? In the next part of our journey, we explore a civilization that rose long after the ice receded, a society that built cities without kings and then chose to vanish. The Indus Valley. They built without monuments, no towering statues, no carved images of kings, no war memorials or temples to the gods, and yet they built cities, vast, carefully planned, precise. The Indus Valley civilization, spanning modern-day Pakistan and northwestern India, flourished for over 2,000 years. By 1900 BCE, it was home to millions. Its cities, Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, Dholavira, were marvels of engineering and urban design. And then, they disappeared. What makes their story so haunting is how advanced and how silent they were. Their streets ran in perfect grids. Homes had private wells. Covered drainage systems ran beneath the roads, more sophisticated than much of Europe's infrastructure thousands of years later. Bricks were standardized. Buildings followed regulated dimensions. Multi-storied dwellings, public granaries, and even flush toilets point to a society that valued hygiene, order, and function. The Great Bath of Mohenjo-daro, sealed with natural bitumen, suggests knowledge of waterproofing and civic planning. But behind all this, no signs of hierarchy, no palaces, no royal tombs, no armies carved in relief. Who were they? How did they manage such scale without centralized rule, religion, or war? We don't know, because they wrote it all down, and we can't read it. Their script, found on thousands of seals and artifacts, remains undeciphered. It is clearly a form of writing, linguistically structured, symbolically consistent, but it shares no roots with known languages. The people of the Indus had long-distance trade, reaching Mesopotamia. Their seals have been found in Sumerian cities. They communicated, they connected, they mattered. And then, sometime between 1900 and 1300 BCE, the cities emptied. Not all at once, not with fire, gradually, quietly. By the time the last city faded, the writing was lost, the planning forgotten, the knowledge dissolved. Why? Some say climate change. Shifting river patterns, including the drying of the once mighty Saraswati, may have starved the cities of water. Others suggest disease or a breakdown in trade. But the cities were not destroyed. They were walked away from. And beneath the dust, archaeologists found something strange. In Mohenjo-daro, in one layer, the bricks had fused into glass, stone melted by heat far beyond what Bronze Age fires could produce. Was it accident or something more? Ancient Sanskrit texts speak of weapons, brahmastras, that could destroy cities in an instant. They speak of flying machines, of wars in the sky, of blinding light and heat. Myth? Possibly, but those texts are rooted in the same land, and their timelines overlap with the Indus Valley's final centuries. We don't know. What we do know is that the people of the Indus Valley did not return. Their descendants, if they remained, left no continuation of their writing, their engineering, their cities. Genetic studies show a population shift. The people there now are not the same. Something broke the chain, and now what remains is a blank space. A culture that lasted longer than ancient Egypt vanished with barely a trace of its identity. They were clean, they were orderly, they were peaceful, as far as we can tell. And then, they were gone. In the next chapter, we travel across oceans and centuries to a people who charted the stars, built with mathematical precision, and vanished into the jungle, the silent fall of the Maya. It began in the jungle. Amid the dense canopy of Central America, great cities rose, stone pyramids, reaching toward the heavens, temples aligned with stars, palaces echoing with ceremony and lore. The Maya civilization thrived for nearly 2,000 years. Their mathematics surpassed that of medieval Europe. Their calendar tracked celestial cycles with a precision that rivals modern systems. They were among the first in the world to develop the concept of zero. They understood deep time, measuring not just years or centuries, but millions of days across overlapping cycles of existence. And then they walked away. Between 800 and 1000 CE, the heart of the Maya world fell silent. Tikal, Copan, Palenque Calakmul. Great cities emptied, pyramids overgrown, writing ceased, roads cracked. The jungle reclaimed its own. What caused this collapse? There were no invading armies, no single catastrophic event. Instead, it was as if an entire civilization collectively decided to end its urban life. But the mystery lies not just in the departure, but in what they left behind. The Maya tracked Venus so accurately they could predict its movements over 500 years to within a fraction of a day. They built observatories, aligned temples to solstices and equinoxes, and understood lunar and solar eclipses centuries in advance. Their buildings reveal advanced acoustics. At Chichen Itza, a clap in front of the pyramid of Kukulkan echoes back as the cry of a sacred bird, the Quetzal. Their roads, Sacbeob, were elevated highways that connected cities across hundreds of miles straight through jungle and swamp. And they did all this without metal tools, draft animals, or wheels. Their writing system, a mix of logograms and syllabic symbols, was the most advanced script in the pre-Columbian Americas. And then, much of it was destroyed. When the Spanish arrived, they burned the Maya codices, thousands of handmade books filled with astronomical data, ritual cycles, and scientific insight. Only 4 survived. One bishop, Diego de Landa, who led the destruction, later realized the magnitude of what he had done. He tried to reconstruct the writing system, but his efforts created confusion that has lasted for centuries. What was lost in the flames? Some believe the Maya may have anticipated their own decline. Their worldview saw history as cyclical, worlds rising and falling according to sacred time. Perhaps in their view the end was not failure, but fulfillment. Yet not all was symbolic. Evidence suggests environmental strain, deforestation, overpopulation, and a series of intense droughts. Warfare between city-states grew more common, political systems fractured. Still, they had faced droughts before. They had built reservoirs, canals, and agricultural systems to survive. Why not this time? Why seal temples? Why abandon knowledge? Some clues remain etched in stone, references to the way, a body of knowledge said to include astronomy, medicine, and the laws of balance. Most of these teachings were inscribed in the very buildings they left behind, buildings that over time crumbled under vines and rain. The Maya did not vanish entirely. Their descendants live on. But the classical civilization, the one that spoke to the stars, fell silent, and what it knew slipped into shadow. As we leave the Maya lowlands, we now turn to the seas, to a people who came not to build, but to destroy, a nameless force that ended an age and left no home, no origin, and no explanation. The Sea Peoples. They came from the waves, not as merchants, not as explorers, but as a force of collapse. Around 1177 BCE, the ancient world trembled. The Hittite Empire, 5 centuries old, burned. Ugarit, a wealthy coastal city, was reduced to ash. Mycenaean palaces fell. Troy was sacked. The Levant crumbled. Egypt, mighty Egypt, barely survived. And at the center of it all stood a mystery: the Sea Peoples. We know them only from fragments. Egyptian reliefs at Medinet Habu show battles against strange invaders, warriors with horned helmets, round shields, and long swords. Their ships were large, built for carrying families and ox carts, not just soldiers. They did not arrive as raiders. They arrived as a civilization on the move. But from where? That question has haunted historians for centuries. Names survive in inscriptions: Peleset Sheridan, Dinyen, Shekelesh. None can be definitively matched to known cultures. Some speculate they were displaced Aegean peoples. Others think they came from the Western Mediterranean, or even farther. But they left no record of themselves. No cities, no language, no homeland. Only ruins in their wake. What made their assault different was its scale and its finality. The Hittite capital, Hattusa, was so thoroughly burned that the very stones fused under the heat. Ugarit's final letters, written hastily on clay, cry for help that never arrived. Trade collapsed. Writing systems vanished. A network that had connected 3 continents fell apart. And when the storm passed, the Sea Peoples themselves vanished. Did they assimilate? Were they defeated? Or did they serve as the final symptom of a wider collapse? Some scholars suggest they were not the cause, but the consequence. Refugees from an earlier disaster, perhaps the same systemic failures that ended the Bronze Age. But that only deepens the question: what disaster drove them to the sea? Their weapons show metallurgical techniques ahead of their time: iron blades, even steel. Their naval organization suggests a high level of coordination. Their military movements were precise, devastating, and without precedent. This was not chaos, it was strategy. And yet, they left nothing behind but fire. Even their memory was nearly lost. Were it not for Egyptian inscriptions, they might have faded completely into myth. The last great battle recorded shows Ramses III defeating the invaders, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. Egypt never recovered its former power. The known world fractured into isolation and silence. No one rebuilt the trade routes. No one re-established the libraries. No one rewrote what was lost. The Sea Peoples remain history's most successful unknown invaders, a people without history who ended history for a time. What makes their story chilling is not just what they destroyed, but that they could do it at all. A civilization capable of bringing down empires can exist and then vanish without a trace. It's a reminder that not every player in history leaves behind a name. Sometimes the greatest forces are faceless, and the loudest moments in time are followed by silence. In our next chapter, we meet a different kind of silence, not imposed by war or fire, but by extinction, the final breath of a kindred species, the Neanderthals. For over 300,000 years, they walked beside us, not shadows, not beasts, but humans of a different kind, the Neanderthals. They hunted mammoths on frozen plains. They built shelters in windswept valleys. They lit fires in deep caves, and then they were gone. By 30,000 years ago, the last of them had vanished from the earth, but their story didn't end, because we carry them in us. Today, nearly every person of European or Asian descent has Neanderthal DNA, 1 to 4%, woven into the human genome, the remnants of a long and complex relationship. And yet for most of our history, we misunderstood them. We called them brutes, cavemen, dim-witted echoes of ourselves, but the evidence tells a different story. They buried their dead with care. crafted tools as refined as those of early Homo sapiens, painted with pigments, wore jewelry, shaped tar from birch bark, a chemical process requiring knowledge of controlled heat and oxygen exclusion. At Bruniquel Cave in France, 155,000-year-old structures built from broken stalagmites were found deep underground, arranged in circles, built in darkness, lit by fire. These were not survival shelters. These were symbols, perhaps ceremonies, perhaps science. Their brains were as large or larger than ours, especially in areas linked to vision and movement. They may have perceived the world with a clarity we can't imagine. But something changed. As Homo sapiens spread into Europe and Asia, the Neanderthals began to disappear. Not immediately, not violently, slowly. For thousands of years, they coexisted. They interbred. They shared ideas, tools, perhaps even stories. And then one branch ended. Why? Some blame competition. Modern humans may have formed larger networks, traded over longer distances, or adapted faster. Others suggest disease. With Homo sapiens bringing pathogens Neanderthals couldn't resist. But there's another possibility. They weren't destroyed. They were absorbed. Their distinct features diluted into the melting pot of humanity. Their culture lost, not through war, but through merging. If so, what did we lose? Cognitive diversity, a parallel way of thinking, a different consciousness. The Neanderthals were not us. They were another kind of human. And their extinction represents more than the loss of a population. It is the silencing of another mind, another way of seeing. They survived in conditions that modern humans would find unlivable. They understood snow, stone, wind, and fire in ways we can't reconstruct. Their knowledge of animal behavior, seasonal patterns, medicinal plants, gone. Even today, we study their bones and tools, trying to reverse engineer their world, trying to remember what they once knew. But memory fades, and with each decade, the gap grows wider. In their absence, we are alone. Once, we were many kinds of human. Now, we are one. What does that unity cost? And what would it mean to share the Earth again? In the next part of our journey, we move from the distant past to a mystery of invention, a discovery buried in clay jars that may rewrite the story of electricity, the electric ancients. In 1936, near Baghdad, a German archaeologist unearthed something strange, a clay jar. Inside, a copper cylinder. Within that, an iron rod. Nothing remarkable until someone filled it with vinegar, and it produced electricity. The Baghdad Battery, they called it. It dates to around 200 BCE. And it works, not by accident, not by natural reaction, but by design. The implications are unsettling. Electricity wasn't supposed to be discovered until the 18th century. But here, in the dust of an ancient Parthian village, was a functioning electrochemical cell, 2,000 years ahead of its time. And it wasn't alone. Similar artifacts have surfaced across the region. Jars with conductive materials, corrosion patterns consistent with exposure to acidic liquids. Some sites contain dozens of these devices. Were they used for electroplating, pain relief, religious rituals? No one knows for sure. But then came a discovery even stranger. At the Temple of Hathor in Dendera, Egypt, carved into stone reliefs, are images that look uncannily like modern light bulbs, bulb-shaped containers with serpentine filaments connected to what appear to be cables. Mainstream archaeology calls them symbolic, but engineers see something else: high-voltage discharge tubes resting on insulating supports. It could be coincidence, Or it could be memory, because inside the pyramids, where these supposed symbols lie, there are no signs of soot, no smoke damage, no torch marks. Yet intricate artwork lines the walls, deep inside chambers that sunlight cannot reach. Polished mirrors have been proposed as a light source, but experiments show their limitations. The angles don't work. The distances are too great. The reflected light too weak. But an electric light, powered by simple voltaic cells, could solve the mystery. And that's not all. Artifacts from Egypt and Mesopotamia show signs of electroplating. Ultra-thin layers of gold fused to surfaces in ways that simple mechanical gilding couldn't achieve. Modern reproduction confirms it would take low-voltage electric current, just like the Baghdad battery. So what happened to this knowledge? Why didn't it spread? Why did it vanish? The answer may lie in another kind of darkness, the deliberate suppression of ancient knowledge. The Library of Alexandria may once have housed texts on electrochemistry, physics, and engineering. Its destruction erased generations of scientific thought. As Christianity spread through the Roman Empire, technologies associated with pagan or mysterious practices were viewed with suspicion, or worse, as heresy. Electromechanical devices may have been buried, forgotten, or reinterpreted as magic. And so, when Benjamin Franklin flew his kite and Volta built his pile, they were not discovering electricity, they were remembering it. The ancient world may have followed a different technological path, one not based on steam or fossil fuels, but on harnessing natural energy in subtle ways. Today, we look at certain artifacts and see only decoration. But what if we're wrong? What if the past built machines we no longer recognize? How many discoveries are hidden in plain sight, catalogued as ceremonial objects, religious icons, or misunderstood fragments? The ancients may have known more than we imagine, not in mythic, fantastical ways, but in practical, forgotten ones. And with every clay jar, every etched stone, every mystery that produces power in our hands, we're forced to ask, what if the future already happened and we've just been catching up? In our next chapter, we journey north to a place once filled with music, farms, and churches, a place that vanished, not in fire, but in frost. The silence of Greenland. They arrived with hope and cattle. In 985 CE, Eric the Red led a fleet of Norse settlers to the western coast of Greenland. What they found was harsh, but survivable. Grass for grazing, fjords for fishing, and valleys for farming. They built stone churches, raised sheep and goats, kept trade ties with Norway. They even had a bishop appointed by Rome. For nearly 500 years, the Norse lived in Greenland. And then they disappeared. By the early 1500s, European ships arriving in Greenland found only silence. The farms were empty, the churches abandoned, no signs of war, no mass graves, no farewell. The settlements had simply ended. We know they existed. We have their tools, their bones, their ruined buildings. We have written records, marriages, baptisms, property transfers, but we don't have a final chapter. What happened? Climate is the first suspect. During the medieval warm period, Greenland was greener, but around the 1300s, temperatures began to drop. The Little Ice Age had arrived. Crops failed, sea ice thickened, trade routes froze over. But climate alone doesn't explain it. The Inuit, living nearby, adapted. They hunted seals, built kayaks, thrived in the cold. The Norse knew of them, Archaeological sites contain Inuit artifacts, so why didn't the Norse adopt their methods? Some evidence suggests they tried. Sewing techniques, bone tools, food remains, but perhaps too little too late. Cultural pride may have played a role. Farming was civilization. Hunting was savagery, or so they believed. But even if they starved, where are the bodies? There are few burials from the final decades, no signs of mass death, no evidence of evacuation. It's as if thousands of people faded into the snow. One haunting discovery: a small church, still intact. Inside, two elderly men, buried with care. Their clothes dated to the late 1400s, decades after the colony was believed abandoned. Someone was still there, still holding on to ritual, still burying the dead. Then, nothing. Some suggest they sailed back to Europe, their ships lost in storms. Others think they merged with Inuit communities, leaving faint genetic traces. But modern DNA studies find little evidence of this. The silence of Greenland remains, not just in ruins, but in the absence of explanation. They built a medieval society in one of Earth's most unforgiving places, and they lasted 5 centuries. Then the ice thickened, the winters stretched, and the sails stopped coming. And when no one came, they stopped writing, stopped building, stopped being seen. Greenland's mystery is not just about disappearance, it's about the fragility of tradition, about how a community can endure for centuries yet be undone by its own reluctance to change. A cautionary tale not of failure, but of rigidity. In the Arctic silence, the Norse left behind everything except their story. And that story, incomplete as it is, now belongs to us. In the next chapter, we return to an even deeper shadow, a civilization that remembered the stars, built with uncanny skill, and left behind a calendar older and more accurate than our own. The Maya, they built with stone and time. Deep in the forests of Central America, the Maya raised cities that spoke to the stars. Pyramids aligned to solstices, temples encoded with mathematics, plazas designed for sound, shadow, and sky. Their calendar tracked celestial cycles with a precision that humbled European science. Their astronomy predicted eclipses centuries in advance. Their mathematics used zero, long before the West did. And then, between 800 and 1000 CE, the great cities fell silent. Tikal, Copan, Palenque abandoned. The collapse wasn't total. Maya civilization endured in the north, in the highlands, in scattered communities, but the classical cities, the heart of the empire, were left behind, overgrown, forgotten. Why? There was no single cause. Environmental records show droughts, long, punishing ones, deforestation, soil erosion, urban sprawl without sustainability. But the Maya were masters of water management. They built reservoirs, canals, agricultural terraces. They had survived droughts before. Why not now? Part of the answer may lie in their worldview. The Maya saw time as cyclical. Ages rose and fell. Worlds were created and destroyed. The end of a cycle was not a failure. It was a return. Could their collapse have been, in part, a choice, a spiritual reset? Inscriptions suggest growing conflict. City-states warring over resources. Elite power structures crumbling under the weight of their own complexity. And then the rituals stopped. Temples were sealed. The carving of dates ceased. The long count calendar rolled into its next Baktun, and no one remained to mark it. What was lost? A vast knowledge system. Mathematics, engineering, medicine, history, cosmology. The Maya script, among the most advanced in the ancient world, was nearly obliterated by Spanish conquerors. Thousands of codices were burned. Only 4 remain. The Bishop of Yucatan, Diego de Landa, realized too late what had been destroyed. His attempt to reconstruct the language created confusion that lasted centuries. The Maya were not primitives. They built aqueducts with pressurized flow, roads that stretched across jungles, and observatories that still tracked the stars. They were scientists, artists, philosophers, and they left behind riddles. In Chichen Itza, the Pyramid of Kukulkan produces a serpent of light during the equinox. An interplay of architecture and astronomy so precise, it still stuns modern engineers. The same pyramid echoes the cry of a sacred bird when you clap at its base. Coincidence? Or something more? Temple inscriptions refer to the way, a body of knowledge passed through generations. Was it lost in the collapse, hidden, or waiting to be remembered? Today, the descendants of the Maya still live in Guatemala, Belize, Mexico. Their culture survives, their language adapts, but the classical age, the golden age, ended with a whisper. Not a war, not a plague, a choice. Or perhaps an inevitability. Even civilizations that understand time cannot always outlast it. In the next part of our journey, we explore one of the strangest claims in historical science. A span of centuries that might never have existed at all. History's missing years. The phantom centuries. What if time lied? Not time as a force of nature, but as a human construct. The calendar, the chronicle, the agreed-upon story of what happened when. What if centuries were inserted where none belonged? This is the question at the heart of the phantom time hypothesis. It suggests that nearly 300 years of the early Middle Ages, between 614 and 911 CE, never happened, that they were fabricated by medieval rulers, seeking to align their reigns with prophetic milestones, that our current year isn't 2026, but something closer to 1729. Absurd? Maybe, but the gaps are real. Across Europe, there is a startling lack of archaeological evidence for those centuries. Coins are missing. Architecture shows abrupt jumps rather than evolution. Pottery styles skip generations. Technological progress appears to stall, then leap forward without transition. Carbon dating, usually reliable, places many supposed 7th and 9th century artifacts either earlier or later. Astronomical records add fuel to the fire. Chroniclers from this period recorded eclipses and planetary events, but modern astronomy shows discrepancies. The sky doesn't match the script. Eclipses that should have occurred during these years didn't. Others that did happen go unmentioned. Even the biographies of key figures, like Charlemagne, are built from documents written generations after their supposed lives. His architectural legacy, like the Palatine Chapel, uses techniques not seen until centuries later. Could it be that Charlemagne was not a man, but a composite? Could history itself be part fiction? Supporters of the theory point to the Holy Roman Emperor Otto III and Pope Sylvester II. According to the story, they wanted to be seen as rulers of the year 1000, a sacred millennial milestone, but they were too early. So they rewrote the past, stretched the timeline, created phantom emperors, forged continuity. Most people were illiterate. Historical records were controlled by monasteries and palaces. The idea isn't that every village was fooled, but that no one had the means to object. Critics dismiss the theory. They point to Chinese, Islamic, and Byzantine sources that appear to span the same period. But even these have inconsistencies. Later compilations, chronologies backdated to match Western timelines. Is it likely that nearly 3 centuries were fabricated? No, but that's not the real revelation. The real insight is this: history is not fixed. It is curated, interpreted, transcribed by people who had reasons, political, spiritual, personal, to present the past in a certain way. And when records are lost, or burned, or never written at all, fictions slip in to fill the void. The phantom time hypothesis, whether true or not, reminds us that we move through a constructed world, a map of memory drawn by flawed hands, and in the spaces where certainty fades, imagination rushes in. We want the past to be orderly, linear, knowable. But what if it isn't? What if time, like memory, has gaps? In our next chapter, we turn to a place where memory was once gathered with purpose: a single building, a beacon, and then a fire. The Library of Alexandria. It stood by the sea, gathering memory. The Library of Alexandria, founded in the 3rd century BCE, was more than a building. It was a vision that all the knowledge in the world could be collected, preserved, and shared. Every ship that entered the harbor was searched. Scrolls were copied, sometimes confiscated. Scholars came from across the known world. Between 400,000 and 1,000,000 texts may have filled its shelves. Mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, medicine, literature, ideas. Then it burned. Not once, but many times. Julius Caesar's siege in 48 BCE may have set the first flame. Centuries later, Christian zealots, seeing pagan knowledge as dangerous, attacked again. Finally, during the Arab conquest in 642 CE, what remained may have been lost. Some historians debate the details, but the outcome is clear. The greatest archive of the ancient world disappeared, and with it, centuries of human understanding. The losses are staggering. Eratosthenes had calculated the Earth's circumference with astonishing accuracy. Aristarchus proposed that the Earth orbited the Sun 1,800 years before Copernicus. Hero of Alexandria built steam-powered devices, automatic doors, programmable machines. Archimedes wrote about infinite series, concepts we now associate with calculus. His works vanished. Only fragments remain. The Renaissance, often celebrated as a rebirth, was in truth a recovery. When European scholars rediscovered Arabic translations of ancient Greek texts, they were stunned. The ancients had already been there, mapped the stars, planned machines, measured the world. What else did we lose? Ancient medicine described surgical techniques and pharmaceuticals lost for over 1,000 years. Engineering manuals detailed construction methods that remain mysterious today. How did they move massive stones, create water pressure, build machines without fossil fuels? The Antikythera mechanism, a mechanical computer from the same world, could track planetary motion, eclipses, and calendar cycles with shocking precision. Was it the only one? Or simply the only survivor? The tragedy of Alexandria isn't just the fire. It's what it reveals about the fragility of knowledge. Scrolls decay, stone erodes, memory fades, and the chain of understanding, passed from teacher to student, generation to generation, can be broken. The library was not merely a place of books. It was humanity's first real attempt to say, what we know must outlive us. We failed, but not completely, because now, scattered in vaults, caves, and forgotten corners of the world, scholars continue to find clues, lost texts, buried inventions, overlooked scrolls reused as bindings for other books. In one such case, a medieval prayer book turned out to to be a palimpsest, an overwritten manuscript, hidden beneath the ink, a lost work of Archimedes. Using modern imaging, scholars uncovered it and discovered that he had anticipated aspects of integral calculus 2,000 years ago. How many other miracles remain hidden? How many scrolls were copied before the fires came? How much of what we think of as modern was once known and forgotten? The library's ashes still blow through history, a reminder that knowledge can die, that wisdom must be protected, and that every generation must choose what it remembers and what it lets go. In our final chapter, we gather the pieces, across continents and centuries, to ask one last question. What do all these gaps say about us and about the future we're building from fragments? Civilization does not move in a straight line. It loops, collapses, rises again. Each age believes itself to be the culmination. Each generation assumes it has finally conquered the darkness of ignorance, chaos, and loss. But history, real history, tells a different story. A story of gaps. 10 mysteries, 10 silences. The Bronze Age collapse swept away empires in a single lifetime, erasing writing, architecture, and identity. The phantom centuries question the very structure of time we live by, asking whether history itself might be a fiction. The Library of Alexandria turned to ash with the knowledge of thousands of years, a fire we're still trying to put out. The Younger Dryas reset humanity with ice and fire, burying a prehistory we may never fully recover. The Indus Valley left behind perfect cities and a script no one can read. The Maya tracked Venus, built celestial calendars, and walked away from their cities without a word. The Sea Peoples erased civilizations, then vanished themselves without leaving even a name. The Neanderthals, our cousins in thought and vision, slipped into extinction, taking with them an entire form of consciousness. Ancient electricity glimmers in forgotten batteries and strange reliefs, hinting at knowledge we rediscovered only millennia later. And the Norse of Greenland, once proud settlers, vanished into the cold, their story ending not in fire or war, but in silence. Each of these isn't just a hole in history. It's a mirror, reflecting how fragile memory is, how easily wisdom can be lost, how many answers we no longer know how to ask. And yet, these gaps don't only tell us what we've lost, they whisper something else, that humanity endures, that even in darkness, even after collapse, we build again, write again, wonder again. The flame passes hands, from cave wall to scroll, from scroll to screen. And we, standing here, are part of that chain. The question is, what will we preserve? What gaps are we leaving for those who come after? Because the next silence may not come with fire or ice. It may come from forgetting, from distraction, from the quiet loss of curiosity. And if we're not careful, the future may look back on us the way we look at these vanished worlds, not with judgment, but with wonder and sorrow. What did they know? Why did they stop? What stories slipped from their hands before they could be passed on? History's hidden chapters remain unwritten, but they are not unreachable. They wait in ruins, in forgotten texts, in the spaces between the stars. We are their inheritors and their continuation. Let us remember, let us ask, let us never stop listening for the voices still buried in the dust. Until next time, when we uncover what else they never taught us, because the greatest mysteries are the ones still waiting to be found.